August 1945. The United States dropped a nuclear bomb on this city. On the first day, around 70,000 people died. By the end of that year, the total was somewhere between 90,000 and 140,000. Historians still argue the exact number, because in the chaos of what followed, nobody could count. Today, 1.2 million people live there. It has a subway, a professional baseball team, and a Michelin-starred restaurant district. April 1986. A reactor accident happened 90 kilometers north of Kyiv. 50,000 people were evacuated. They were told it would be 3 days. 40 years later. Still empty. Both places were hit by radiation. One came back. And for most of my life, I assumed the difference was the physics, that Chernobyl's radiation was categorically worse in some fundamental way, and that's why nobody went home. It's not that. The explanation is weirder. And once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. When someone says nuclear explosion, and I mean the moment before you can think about it, what shows up? A white flash, a fireball, a dead city. And then, stretching forward from there, this formless, permanent contamination, a poisoned future with no end date. That reflex is real, and it was put there deliberately. The Cold War built it, Hollywood refined it. Every decade since has added a layer. And the reason it exists at all is that nuclear weapons are genuinely catastrophic. The blast at Hiroshima erased people, buildings, and anything resembling a functional city in the same second. The burns were unlike anything military medicine had seen. The hospitals collapsed exactly when they were needed most. None of that is exaggerated. But the reflex doesn't stop at the blast. It keeps running. It tells you that anyone touched by radiation is permanently broken. Their children are broken. Their grandchildren are broken. The land is broken forever. And that part, the forever part, is where the story departed from what the science eventually found. I want to show you something before we go further, because the public's relationship with nuclear fear has never been a clean, straight line. In the early 1950s, Las Vegas leaned into nuclear testing as a tourism feature. The Nevada test site was 65 miles from the Strip. Hotels sold atomic cocktails. They held a Miss Atomic Bomb beauty pageant, a contestant in a mushroom cloud swimsuit. The cloud was on postcards. People drove from Los Angeles for the weekend to watch. The public's emotional response to radiation has always been shaped by something other than the dose. In 1955, it was novelty and spectacle. By 1983, it was existential terror. The physics didn't change. The story around the physics changed. October 1957. A British reactor catches fire. Not figuratively, literally, catches fire. There's open flame inside a nuclear reactor, burning at over 3,000 degrees Celsius in a building full of graphite and uranium. And for about 48 hours, the people responsible for it had no idea what to do. To understand how this happened, you need to know one thing about graphite. Under neutron bombardment, the crystal structure of graphite slowly deforms, storing energy inside itself, like a compressed spring. Release it wrong, and you get a burst of heat from inside the material itself, from nowhere visible at unpredictable moments. A Nobel Prize-winning physicist named Eugene Wigner figured this out in the 1940s. The solution is straightforward in principle. Heat the reactor deliberately, on a controlled schedule, and let the stored energy release slowly. The Windscale team had done this 8 times without incident. The 9th time, on October 7, 1957, something went wrong. They heated the reactor, they put the control rods back in, the temperature kept climbing anyway. They heated it again, still climbing. Over 48 hours, with no explanation from the instruments, which were few and poorly placed, the reactor temperature climbed to 400 degrees Celsius. Then they shut the reaction down entirely. The temperature kept climbing. At that point, a man named Tom Toohey was pulled out of bed. He was the deputy shift manager. His whole family had the flu. He wasn't feeling great himself. He came in anyway, walked up to the reactor, opened one of the fuel loading hatches, and looked inside with his own eyes. Dark cherry red. That's 800 degrees Celsius, and it was getting brighter. They tried pushing the burning fuel cartridges out with rods. They'd fused to the channels. They tried CO2. Didn't help. By the night of October 10th, the temperature was over 3,000 degrees. Magnesium fuel casings burning, lithium burning, uranium beginning to oxidize on its surfaces, and 1,900 tons of graphite sitting in airflow, because this was an air-cooled reactor. The graphite itself was starting to burn. Tom Toohey sent everyone else off the site. He and the head of the fire service stayed. He climbed onto the roof of the reactor, and they started pumping water directly into the burning channels through the fuel loading ports. Pouring water into a 3,000-degree fire means the water splits into hydrogen and oxygen before it does anything useful. That hydrogen, mixed with the chimney air, could have produced an explosion that ended the conversation entirely. Tom Toohey stood on that roof all night, watching the inspection hatches for signs of whether it was working. At some point around dawn, he noticed he couldn't lift one of the hatches. The pressure had dropped. The temperature was falling. He kept going. By the following afternoon, the reactor was cold. He drove home and went to sleep. The British government classified the details for years. The initial public statement said there had been a slight increase in radioactive discharge. The contaminated milk from farms downwind, they quietly dumped it for weeks. An independent inquiry later estimated that the accident probably caused around 240 cancer cases over the following decades, with roughly 100 of those fatal. Tom Toohey was eventually given an Order of the British Empire about 15 years later. He went on to live to 91. He died in 2008. The chimney on the Windscale reactor, by the way, the one with a strange filter cap at the top, was installed because one engineer insisted on it against the objections of almost everyone else on the project. The project manager called him crazy. The filters caught a significant fraction of what would have otherwise gone straight into the atmosphere over northwest England. Without them, the story of Windscale would look very different. With them, it's a story most people have never heard of. In 1947, the United States and Japan set up a joint research program to track every traceable survivor of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the rest of their lives. It's now called the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, the Life Span Study. Around 120,000 people enrolled, followed for close to 80 years, the longest, most detailed radiation health study ever conducted. The data from that study is public. It's been reviewed, contested, replicated, and extended for decades. Here's what it found. Leukemia rose measurably. It peaked about 6 to 8 years after the bombs. The closer a survivor was to the hypocenter, the higher the risk. Children were more vulnerable than adults. That's real, measurable, not in dispute. Solid cancers, stomach, lung, breast, thyroid, also rose, gradually, in proportion to dose. Real. Also not in dispute. And then there's the part that gets left out of most conversations. For survivors who are roughly 2.5 kilometers or more from the hypocenter, and a large number of people in both cities were at that distance or beyond, the Lifespan study has spent 8 decades struggling to detect a statistically clear excess cancer signal. The researchers kept looking. They're still looking. For many of those survivors, the trajectory of their health across a full lifetime was not distinguishable from the general Japanese population. Their children, the first generation born to bomb survivors, have also been studied extensively. The chromosome data, the cancer rate data, the birth defect data, no significant excess. RERF has published this repeatedly, and it keeps not making headlines. One more fact that will break your intuition. There's a city in Iran called Ramsar. It sits on hot springs with naturally occurring radium concentrations. Some residents receive background radiation between 10 and 200 times the global average. In specific spots, more per year than what radiation workers in most countries are legally allowed to receive in an entire year. Multiple studies have examined their cancer rates. The results are, at minimum, not consistent with the idea that radiation at those levels produces the kind of harm the mythology predicts. The Ramsar data is contested, and I won't overstate it, but it belongs in the conversation. The word that matters in nuclear health science is dose. A dose is a measured quantity with measured effects. It's not a curse, not a stain, not a sentence. Whew. That distinction is the whole video. There's a nuclear accident that almost never appears in documentaries, and I think about it more than Chernobyl. January 3rd, 1961, a tiny experimental reactor in the Idaho desert exploded. 3 men were working that night. All 3 died. The SL-1 was a strange machine. It ran on uranium enriched to 93%. For context, weapons grade is typically 80 to 85%. This was more enriched than most bomb material, installed in a reactor operated by 3 people in an unmanned stretch of Idaho, with minimal safety equipment and a single central control rod that had to be raised manually. The logic behind it was that a small, highly portable, long-running reactor could power remote Arctic radar stations during the Cold War. The extreme enrichment kept the reactor compact and gave it years of fuel life without resupply. What it also gave it, though, was very little margin between normal operation and catastrophe. The central control rod, the one controlling the reaction, needed to be lifted exactly 10 centimeters during maintenance to reconnect its drive mechanism. If lifted 50 centimeters, the reactor would go prompt critical in milliseconds. On the night of January 3rd, someone lifted it 50 centimeters. Within 4 milliseconds, the power output hit 20,000 megawatts, roughly 6,000 times the reactor's rated power. The water flashed to steam instantly. The reactor vessel jumped 3 meters into the air. One of the men was found pinned to the ceiling by a control rod, driven through his body by the explosion. The other 2 were found nearby. What happened? The official investigation couldn't fully determine it. The reactor had a documented history of the central rod jamming during exactly this procedure. Dozens of recorded instances of it sticking, requiring extra force to move. One theory, the rod stuck. The technician pulled harder. It broke free suddenly, and he lifted it 50 centimeters before he could correct. The other theory involves the fact that one of the 3 men had received a phone call about 20 minutes before the explosion from his wife. She was calling to say she wanted a divorce. The men had complicated personal histories. Some investigators suggested that one of them, possibly the man who took that call, deliberately pulled the rod. The case was never resolved. There was no second accident at an American nuclear plant for decades. And the first one killed exactly 3 people. The reactor was buried in its pit in the Idaho desert and has barely been mentioned in public discussions since. March 28, 1979. A reactor at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania starts behaving badly. Not dramatically. A pump failure in the secondary cooling circuit, then a stuck pressure relief valve that nobody noticed because there was no indicator for the valve's physical position. The indicator they had showed whether the valve had received an electrical signal to close, not whether it had actually closed. The difference cost roughly $1.25 to detect. Nobody spent the dollar. Water drained out of the primary circuit through the open valve for over 2 hours before the next shift arrived, looked at a warm pipe that should have been cool, and figured it out. The nuclear reaction itself had been shut down automatically, correctly, within 8 seconds of the original fault. By second 8, the chain reaction was over. Everything that followed was plumbing. Extremely high temperature, high pressure, radioactive plumbing, but plumbing. The reactor's residual heat gradually evaporated the coolant water. The fuel partially melted, hydrogen accumulated inside the containment building. The operators, who didn't understand what was happening, made a series of decisions that made each step worse. 16 hours after the accident began, they finally got stable cooling running. The reactor was brought under control. The fuel that had melted stayed inside the containment vessel. Nothing crossed the fence line of the plant at a dose that would cause health effects. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission later calculated that the average dose to people within 10 miles of the plant was about 8 millirem. A chest X-ray delivers about 6. The China Syndrome was a thriller about a fictional nuclear accident at an American power plant. It starred Jack Lemmon and Jane Fonda. A character in the film says, casually, that a meltdown could create a contamination zone the size of Pennsylvania. It was released on March 16, 1979, 12 days before 3 Mile Island. 140,000 people left the area around the plant in the days that followed. They weren't ordered to. The governor had suggested that pregnant women and children within 5 miles might want to leave. 140,000 people decided that description included them. A Catholic priest in a nearby town held an emergency mass and told the congregation it might be their last, and offered collective absolution. People in the pews began screaming. What stopped it was Jimmy Carter. He drove to the plant on April 1st, 4 days into the crisis, walked in wearing a suit, let them show him around the control room, and walked out. That's it. Just the sight of the president walking into the building and walking out alive was enough to break the collective psychological spiral that had been building for days. After the accident, 2,000 people filed lawsuits claiming health damages from the radiation. Every single case was dismissed by the courts. The judges required medical evidence of dose. The doses were below the threshold for any measurable health effect. Not one case survived. For 30 years after 3 Mile Island, no new nuclear construction permits were issued in the United States. An accident that killed nobody, contaminated nobody, and was contained entirely within its own building, destroyed an industry for a generation. The mythology didn't need a real casualty. It just needed 12 days of movie audiences and one jammed valve. Chernobyl is the one that earns the mythology. I want to be clear about that before anything else. April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. It ejected roughly 5,000 cubic meters of hydrogen into the open air, where it mixed and detonated. Burning graphite blocks were thrown across the site. The reactor core was exposed to the sky. 600,000 people were eventually involved in the cleanup, the liquidators as they were called, many of whom received significant radiation doses. The immediate area was contaminated in ways that took decades to partially map. But the specific mechanism of what happened is something that most people don't know, and it matters. The RBMK reactor at Chernobyl was a graphite-moderated design with a documented structural flaw. When the control rods, the rods that shut down the reaction, were inserted from their raised position, the graphite tips at the bottom of each rod temporarily displaced cooling water before the neutron-absorbing sections of the rod reached the lower part of the core. For a few seconds after you press the emergency stop button, the reactor's output at the bottom of the core actually increased. The operators that night had spent hours running the reactor in a degraded state, trying to complete an experiment that had already been delayed. The reactor had fallen into what engineers call xenon poisoning, a condition where a buildup of xenon isotopes absorbs neutrons and suppresses the reaction. To keep the experiment going, the operators had pulled almost every control rod out of the core. The reactor was unstable. When the experiment finally ran and they pressed the emergency stop, pressing that button may have been what initiated the explosion, the safety system might have caused the accident. This has been debated by nuclear engineers for 4 decades, and the answer is still not clean. What is clear? 28 to 31 people died from acute radiation syndrome in the weeks following the accident. A measurable increase in thyroid cancer appeared in children in the surrounding regions, linked to radioactive iodine that contaminated the local milk supply in the days immediately after the accident, before authorities restricted it. Long-term cancer effects in the wider population remain scientifically contested and range widely across different studies. The social and economic damage to the Soviet Union and to the psychology of everyone who lived through the coverage was enormous and impossible to measure. 600,000 liquidators, 350,000 people permanently resettled, an exclusion zone the size of Luxembourg still largely uninhabited, and Pripyat still empty. March 11, 2011. Japan recorded its most powerful earthquake in recorded history. By some measures, one of the 4 or 5 most powerful earthquakes in all of recorded human history. It generated a tsunami with waves up to 14 meters high. Close to 20,000 people died. Entire towns were erased. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant was in the path of the tsunami. When the earthquake hit, the reactors shut down automatically, correctly. Control rods dropped, chain reactions stopped. All of it worked as designed. And then the 14-meter wave came over the seawall, flooded the basement where the backup diesel generators were housed, and destroyed external power connections. The plant went dark. No instruments, no pumps, no way to know what was open and what was closed. The crew had legal and moral grounds to evacuate. They stayed for 5 days. They improvised cooling using fire trucks. They manually opened pressure relief valves. They prevented the spent fuel pools from boiling dry, which would have produced a far larger contamination event than what actually happened. Hydrogen built up and exploded. 3 of the reactor buildings blew their roofs off in the footage that went around the world. But the reactor vessels themselves were not breached. The fuel stayed inside the containment. Nobody in the surrounding area received a dose sufficient to cause acute radiation sickness. The average exposure in Fukushima Prefecture was 4 millisieverts. For reference, a CT scan delivers around 10. The crew who stayed and fought for 5 days prevented exposures that would have been orders of magnitude larger. The evacuation killed more people than the radiation did. That sentence should stop you. Not because the nuclear accident was fine, it wasn't, but because the decision about who was endangered and who needed to move was made on the basis of the mythology, not the measurement. Entire towns that had measured radiation levels lower than parts of Cornwall, UK, or Denver, Colorado, were emptied and have stayed empty because of what radiation means, not because of what radiation measured. Germany shut down its last 3 nuclear power plants in April 2023. The decision to phase out nuclear power accelerated after Fukushima, in a country that had experienced no nuclear accident, whose reactors were running and generating clean electricity in the middle of an energy crisis driven by dependence on Russian gas. Coal particulates don't have a symbol. They cause cardiovascular disease and lung cancer slowly, quietly, across decades, without a single event that generates a news cycle or an HBO series. Nobody makes a documentary called The Ruhr Valley Effect. There's no exclusion zone around a coal plant. There's just a statistical elevation in respiratory illness among people who live near one, invisible and uncounted. Then, Pripyat, the school with textbooks still on the desks, the amusement park that opened 4 days before the accident and closed forever. Hiroshima came back because the people who rebuilt it treated their situation as a measurable problem. They went home, they built, their children were healthy, their grandchildren are healthy. The Peace Memorial stands in the middle of a functioning modern city, which is exactly what they intended. Pripyat is empty because the measurement got replaced by the mythology. The Soviet state, then the Ukrainian state, then the international community decided the symbol was larger than the science. That may have been the right decision for the most contaminated areas immediately around the reactor. For large parts of the exclusion zone, the evidence is much less clear, and the emptiness has continued long past any defensible technical justification. Two cities, one story based on measurement, one story based on fear. Two completely different futures. I've spent time with 5 nuclear accidents now. Windscale, where a man stood on a burning reactor all night and lived to 91, and the British government hid the details for decades. SL1, 3 soldiers, a design that was barely sane, a mystery that was never solved. 3 Mile Island, an accident that hurt nobody and destroyed an industry for 30 years because a movie came out 12 days before. Chernobyl, a reactor with a broken design, operators who pushed it past every limit, and a button that may have caused the explosion it was supposed to prevent. Fukushima, a crew that stayed when they could have left and prevented something much worse, while the world watched the wrong parts of the story. What runs through all 5 is the same thing. The physics was measurable. The fear was not. Nuclear weapons deserve your fear. The blast, the burns, the immediate destruction, all of it earned. The long-term radiation effects are real, and in high-dose populations, they are serious. Leukemia, solid cancers, documented, not speculative. But the version where radiation is an eternal curse that moves through generations, where every exposed person is permanently destroyed, where cities touched by fallout can never come back, that version is not the science. That version is a story, and it has been running energy policy, evacuation decisions, and the careers of politicians for 70 years. The blast is real. The cancer risk is real. Ramsar is real. The dismissed lawsuits are real. TUI standing on that roof is real. The Fukushima crew staying for 5 days is real. All of it is real, and none of it fits neatly into the version of the story that most people carry around. If something in this video landed differently than you expected, drop it in the comments. I read them. I push back where I think you're wrong. Subscribe if you like that. See you next time.